Should only take a minute or two to get everyone back in. So, one of you, your mic's on. Like, it's fine, but just so you know, I can hear you like breathing and chewing. So, if you don't want it to be on, that's. All right. Do we have people in? Okay, so people are coming in. Great. So let's power through this part so I can get to the review. I'm sure that's what the part that you care about most. Okay, so when we're talking about the work, that's where we left off, right? Sorry. There are 3 requirements that Skocpol says are necessary. One second. For those of you that were in WebEx, I just muted you all because I don't know if you can't tell that your mic's on or you can't hear me or whatever, but I can hear all the background noise through like loudspeakers in this auditorium. So it's just a little distracting. If you were communicating or want to talk to me, just text that you want to say something and I'll turn your mic back on. But for now, I just muted everyone in the WebEx. So the first part, right, is this structural perspective, right? We have to take a structural perspective if we want to follow the same approach that Skocpol is, right? This is by the environment. The structural determines this behavior. We have to reference international systems. The global context matters, right? Why are there so many democracies in the world today? Because the powerful states are democracies. If the Soviets had won the Cold War, communist states would be the common behavior, right? Capitalism sort of wins in the 1990s, right? As far as like state behavior, this third wave, and capitalist democracies become the norm. That's the normal sort of aspect of it. So the next part is that you have to have a state being treated as more than just a forum, right? And we'll talk about how states are treated. But what matters here is that states have an administration and they have a coercive apparatus. They have the police, but they also have the bureaucracy. So they have rules. It's not just the state exists and the people behave however they behave. There are rules to how the state behaves. There are resources that the state can use. How can they use those resources? Remember, coercion is making you do something you don't want to do. That's very different from influence, right? I can't force you to wear a mask, right? That's one of those things. Coercive would be, you have to wear a mask, and if you don't, I will put one on you or I'll arrest you. Influence is saying, everyone has to wear a mask, and if you go into a store and refuse to wear a mask, I'm going to find that store, right? I'm going to influence their behavior by saying it's going to cost you money not to have masks, right? And there are businesses, elite businesses, that don't require their customers to wear masks, and they're not worried about the fine because of the amount of money that comes in, right? So they can still be shut down and other factors like that. But that's different. Coercion is where I force your behavior, and usually through very violent means, right? If I don't like what you're doing in your assembly, I throw tear gas, I shoot you with rubber bullets, right? That's coercive, right? There's a coercive apparatus. But there's also rules, right? If you file a permit in the United States to protest, the police have to come and protect you in that protest. That's part of the aspect that exists. And because the state is this apparatus and it's got this coercive aspect, administrative aspect, it is different from society, right? Governments make laws. Society has norms and values, governments make laws. They are separate, they are distinct, and we have to make sure we do this in order to follow sort of Skocpol's rules. That's the only way we can really look at these cases and understand why social revolution is occurring. So why is there a problem with this when we're talking about the normal understanding of revolutions? Normally, when we talk about a revolution, it's purposive, right? And this is part of the problem. That's Skocpol makes this argument, this is part of the problem. When we talk about a revolution, we always think of like Che Guevara and these sort of ideas that were like, oh, we're going to come together and my idea is revolution. That's not really how it works, right? Revolutionaries don't just say, we're going to be revolutionary. They follow a procedure. And so it's not that they decide as individuals to be revolutionaries. They're in a structure where they don't get the response that they want. And then they say, okay, let's go to more and more extremes until we can pursue. And how much does it matter to us, right? Can we be co-opted? Can we be bought out, right? Okay, you won't give the reforms, but you're going to give me, right, some sort of social safety net. Right? I'm not going to make sure that everyone's treated equally, but if you fall below a certain poverty level, I'm going to provide you with resources and food and shelter, right? That's an exchange, right? So this person is saying, we want a revolution, we're going to go for it. No, usually the structure follows. And we want to follow one as logical expectations. Do we just start with saying we want a revolution, or do we start with, okay, things need to change? Things need to change, and then it follows what's called this chronological order. So I'm going to use the order of the U.S. This isn't always the order that follows. But the first thing is that everyone has grievances, right? Let's just say we agree. Everyone is unhappy about something. Something the government is doing is wrong. No matter who you are, there's going to be something you're like, I want something different. Really, really strong liberals, right? Even if they're sort of moderate liberals and they really like Biden, they're still going to critique Biden, right? They're going to say, I don't like this thing that he's doing, right? That Obama was called the deporter-in-chief, right? That there are liberals who don't like what he did. There are liberals, so there's always going to be grievances. Everyone's going to be mad about something. The normal process is you say, I don't like this, so I'm going to go to my local official, or I'm going to go to the government in some way, and I'm going to have a demand for redress, a redress of grievances. I'm going to say, I don't like the way this aspect works, or I feel I was negatively impacted by this, and therefore, I want you to do something. And if they do it, right, if you say, my neighbor's hedges are way over into my yard, the government will send them a notice and say, you need to cut your hedges, and then usually they'll cut their hedges, right, and it doesn't escalate from there. If the government says, no, we're not going to help you, and it's something more serious than hedges, you're like, I don't have a right to vote in this country, and they say, well, too bad. And you're like, well, now I demand reform. I demand that the laws be changed, right? This is suffragettes, right? I demand that I be allowed to vote, right? And so then, if they refuse again, and they say, no, we're still not going to do that, or when they start to repress, right? You're making these demands, I don't want you to make these demands, so I'm going to start tear gassing your assemblies, I'm going to try and stop you, I'm going to arrest those of you that are in the leadership to stop you, I become more coercive and more repressive. Then you start saying, I want a new government. And here when I say new government, you're saying, I want to elect new people, I want to change the way the government functions, I want to get someone else in there to take charge, right? And this is, if you think about the suffragettes in the 20th century, they're like, either support us, or when we do get the right to vote, we'll vote you out and replace you. Or we'll make sure that we campaign hard enough that the people who sort of get in, right? And some of that comes together. Then, if you can't change the law, and you can't get any redress for your grievances, right? And you can't get the government to change, and the elites are just locked into power, and there's no way to change the system or to better your station, then you call for revolution. It is a chronological order of behaviors. It is not a purposive, right? You don't start with saying revolution is the thing that I want. You say, I want my life to change in this way, and then it becomes harder and harder to say the entire system has to change in order for us to get that, right? So the purposive image is flawed because it's not the way people work. People follow the structure, right? They look to their governments to fix problems, and then when they won't fix problems or they can't fix problems, they start looking at ways to change the government. And if it's so broken there's no way to fix it, then they demand a new government. Then they demand a new system. When we talk about the international context, the first part is this uneven spread of capitalism, right? Capitalism spreads very slowly. It spreads very differently, right? The UK is a very different capitalist country than China, right? China has capitalist expectations. It's much more capitalist today than it was, right? But it still identifies as a communist country, even though it's one of the largest market economies in the world, right? It is definitely considered itself a communist. So capitalism is very different in these two cases. So that international context exists. The other identity aspect is nation-state formation. Do they share an identity? Do the groups of people in that state share an identity? One of the things about the Chinese national identity, even though they have different languages, even though they have different cultures and beliefs and religions, is that for thousands of years, one dynasty, right, or one sort of exchangeable dynasty, right, basically created a system where if you wanted to advance, you had to take a test in Mandarin, you have to get into the system of bureaucracy, you had to work up these bureaucratic stations until you got higher up in the government. So their national identity is very strong, even though there's this massive sort of land mass, right, this massive country with all of this population and very diverse in culture, ethnicity, and language, because they had something to force that one shared identity. That doesn't exist, right? China has a much longer history, right, and a much longer shared history than other places, right, especially compared to Western states, which have very short histories because of human exploration. We have to look at norm diffusion, which we talked about a bit. What values exist in the system, right? We know that today self-determination is sort of this universal argument. The UN has what's called the UN Universal Declaration of Universal Human Rights, right? That there's this declaration that says, here are all the things that you have a right to as a human being, right? That's something that's new. That's something that sort of came up in the 1990s, that we had to say, everyone deserves these things no matter where they're born or where they're from. And then you see in some places very, very Marxist values, right? Capitalism creates winners and losers. It's very problematic. We need to do better, right? That's part of it. The other part is state competition and comparison, right? With modernization and industrialization, all states have a couple of things. One is that they actually conform quite a bit to how an economy works, right? You need more skilled labor, you need a more educated workforce, you need better trade conditions. So everyone's working together, and they're working in competition, right? Competition always exists and comparison always exists. If you're exporting more rice than you're importing, that puts you at a very good advantage, right? And one of the things is that the United States actually can grow more rice than any other country. We just have the natural geographic environment for it, right? That California grows more, by its land mass, it grows more than like 20% of the world's food, right? Whether that gets eaten or not or destroyed, it's not really important. It is a huge agricultural economy, and it has this other massive economy that's going with it. But agricultural production is massive in California. But does that mean that all of those products are getting exported? No, because those other states are trying to prevent California goods from going all over the world. They don't want that sort of import of a good they can produce in their own country, right? You don't want to have that exchange. So there's a lot of competition that we have to recognize. So we look at the way states behave, they might behave differently because they're competing. They might have some protectionism when they say we're not going to accept certain products from certain countries because they're trying to help their own economy, right? And we'll see this quite a bit moving forward, right? That it's not that I dislike the other person, right? It's not that I don't want, right? If you're China, you say it's not that we have a somewhat contentious, but much better than it was before Nixon, right? That not to praise Nixon in any way, but we have better relations with China. They're sort of contentious now, but it's all in diplomacy and disagreements, and it's all in words. There's no violence expected, right? There's no rational person would expect a war between China and the United States because we're dealing with this diplomatically. We're saying, We don't want each other's exports, right? We don't want Chinese rice and they don't want American rice, right? Because they want to use their domestic products. They want to export, right? They don't want to import. They want a better trade position. They want to make a better economy for their population and their citizens. So that competition drives a lot of that behavior. All right. So Skocpol says you can't just treat the state as a forum, right? This is what she is arguing against, right? It can't be a forum. It can't just be everyone's exchanging ideas and it's sort of this hollow shell and nothing's occurring. You can't just treat it like a coercive aspect. You can't say the state is pure coercion, right? But not that that's right, not that that's moral or immoral, but it's inaccurate, right? You're missing something. And so the next part is why you have to look at it. The state is autonomous. It's an autonomous structure. The state acts on its own accord for a number of reasons. The first is that states need popular support. So sometimes the bureaucracy, the administration that exists, will say, yeah, I know the elites want one thing, but if I lose the popular support, it doesn't matter. So I'm going to try and find this middle ground where the elites aren't completely dissatisfied. They can accept the outcome, and I have the popular support, and I have legitimacy, right? The way in which we made decisions seem legitimate, right? And legitimacy can be done a number of ways. There's all these different types of legitimacy. Sometimes we talk about process legitimacy or path legitimacy, right? If the way that we go about it is legitimate, then the outcome doesn't have to be as legitimate because we did it about the right way. We followed the rules, we followed the process that exists, and if it's in favor of one group a little, it's okay because everyone had a right to engage and speak to that topic. Now, we also talk about state regimes and institutions. They want to survive. If you have a bureaucracy in a government, right, if we're talking about Zimbabwe or China or the United States or any country, that bureaucracy wants to stay the way it is. And so it's going to try and survive with or without elites. It's going to try and manage this. And if they're successful, when we talk about rule of law in a state, what we really mean is a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, right? A state is being very effective at showing its legitimacy when people accept that the only person, the only body, the only actor that can visit violence upon another person is the state, right? The state is the only one that has the right to arrest, to prosecute, right? No one else has that legitimate use of force where they can seize someone, arrest them, and detain them. Now, if they're doing it wrong, there's still a problem. But a legitimate state is one in which they say, no, only the state can arrest you. Only the state can send you to jail. Governments, corporations can't send you to jail, right? Individuals can't send you to jail. Religious groups can't send you to jail, right? Ethnic groups can't make that decision. Only the government can decide about your arrest, your detain, right, and your prosecution, right? That's rule of law, right? And it applies to everyone, right? Rule of law also means it has to apply to everyone, including those in government. The last part is, what are the cases? We're going to be talking about France, Russia, and China. And we're actually not going to talk about the day. I don't need you to give exact details on these cases because we just won't have time to cover them. What I'm concerned about, what is the argument, and Geddes lays out this argument much clearer. What is the argument? Why are they coming to different arguments, right? Why is Skocpol saying that selection on dependent variable is fine, right? It's very important that when we're looking at France, Russia, and China, one of the things that Skocpol says is, I don't want to look at former colonies. Why don't I want to look at former colonies? Because they're going to behave differently than states that have social revolution based on external threat, right? If you have an external threat, but you have a colonial backer, you may not go through a revolution. You're saying, that's not a threat to me, that's a threat to the UK, that's a threat to my colonial ruler, not a threat to me directly. And so you don't want to look at former colonial rules according to Skocpol, and that's different. And then also, there are very clear similarities in these cases, in the old regimes of these cases, right? If you look at pre-revolutionary France, Russia, and China, they share a few characteristics. The first is incapacitated state machinery. So in all of these cases, they couldn't fight a war. They couldn't win a war against an external threat. France is a little iffy, but the argument is that they couldn't do that. They also couldn't provide goods and services at a high level. The government had broken down, and they weren't providing basic skills, basic responsibilities of the government. So it had been incapacitated. The next is the lower classes were in widespread rebellion. The peasantry, the proletariat, whatever language we're going to use, the lower class, the labor class, was in widespread rebellion. In different parts of the country, all of the country, in large numbers, they were rejecting the system that existed, the class system and the political system. And then you had mobilization by political leaderships. You had those elites saying, we're going to come and pick up you, the large labor class, and we're either going to make it possible for the laborers to be better off in their station, or we're going to include some of you in the government, right? Remember, there are two options here, right? You can either co-opt and say, well, it's not going to change dramatically, but some of you who are in leadership positions, you'll be in the government, you'll be able to make decisions. Or a real social revolution is, we're going to change it so that laborers and farmers can be successful and wealthy and do better. So those are all options. All right, so now let me stop sharing, and one more. Oh, sorry. So now we're just going to talk about selection bias. There we go. Okay. So now let's talk about selection bias. And Geddes makes a really strong argument. It becomes this really great debate. And it's not that one of them is absolutely wrong. That's not really the case. The debate we're going to see is Geddes says, you're making this argument, there's a problem with it. There's a problem with the argument that you're making, and I'm going to explain to you why it's wrong, right? And so Geddes starts with, and she writes a whole book about this. This article is just a summation. There's a whole book called Paradigms and Sandcastles, where she just says, whenever you're building the models, they're only fit for so many things, and they can sort of get washed away like a sandcastle on the beach, right? That they don't fit, they don't last long, right? We're not building great models to sort of stand the test of time. We're building sort of ad hoc models that only fit for a few cases and then don't last. So Geddes says, well, one of the problems with Skocpol's work and other types of work is selection on the dependent variable. And if you're a graduate student of any kind, one of the first things that we talk about is don't select on the dependent variable. It's very taboo. Now, skilled authors will say, well, maybe if you know what you're doing, you can make a good case. But when you're in grad school, they just say, no, don't do it. You can't figure it out, don't bother, right? Just get away from it, right? This problem is too difficult. Just don't use the dependent variable when you're selecting your cases. So why? The first part, right, so we're getting a little redundancy, so we'll go a little faster, is that you're only getting half the picture. You're only seeing what the cases have in common, right? And so it fails to test the validity of the argument because you don't know if that argument is sound. You don't know if if those things in those cases, if not included, was outside the same case, right? So when you're looking at other cases, would they be different? How would they be different, right? And are we assuming that they're different? So here's the thing. When we make an assumption, we say, we're going to treat this as true. And if we say we're going to treat this as true, and it's not, it's false, that's going to damage our entire model, the validity of our model, the scientific nature of our model, right? It's not going to be internally valid. But often when you select on the dependent variable, you say cases that are different from this, they're different in a way that we may not have to look at them. We're going to assume that they're different, right? We're going to assume that other than France, China, and Russia, those other cases are different in some way, right? That they don't have the autonomous nature, they don't have those other factors. And then that leads to this idea, are we really getting the right answer, or are we finding a spurious relationship, right? And we've talked about this a lot. This is the swimming and ice cream example, right? The two factors have a high amount of correlation, right? They increase at the same time, but they don't cause each other. X does not cause Y. Swimming does not cause ice cream consumption. That's not the relationship, right? Something else is causing it. So now let's talk about these new industrialized countries. Let's give some examples, concrete examples of what I mean. In all of these countries, they had labor suppression. All of them. Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Brazil, and Mexico. All of them had labor suppression. And what do I mean? They lowered the wages. They artificially kept the wages low so that you wouldn't have domestic consumption, so that the individuals wouldn't have, so that the economy could produce more with less, right? And so instead of buying the product, right, if you don't pay your laborers very well, they can't afford the products they're making. So it gets sold, it gets exported. And so then what you do is you break up into unions. You don't allow unions. And if people assemble, as we saw like farmers in the 1920s in the United States, you go as the government and you break them up. You don't allow them to assemble. You make sure they can't communicate. You make sure that they don't organize. You pass laws that limit their ability to organize. You make sure that happens. And then, right, because they have less wages and because they don't have a union, they can't buy the domestic product and you have more exports. Now, this seems very inappropriate morally, but it's a very sound argument if you want to increase your exports. Right? It's rational for a state to behave this way if they want to industrialize. Because the next thing that you do, right, you've increased your exports, which means you have income coming in, right? Essentially, you have income coming in. You have wealth coming into that country. And so you use that money, South Korea is the example that we're going to use here, is you take this low value added good. They use textiles, right? And textiles is just sort of cloth, like before it's cut, bolts of cloth before it's cut into clothing and made into clothes, right? They're just making these cloth bolts, right, these big things of cloth, and they're shipping them out to be sold so that other people can make clothes. So it's a low value added good because you didn't add a lot of value. You just took fabric, or you just took materials and you made it into fabric, right, cotton into bolts of cotton fabric. And then you sell it. And then you use all that money that you're making through that industry and you're funding an industry like in South Korea, the Daewoo car industry, right? South Korea wanted to industrialize. So what they decided is they were going to take all this added economic stimulus that they were getting from selling textiles, and they were going to develop an auto industry. And in order to do that, one of the things they were going to do is they weren't going to let a lot of car companies sell in South Korea. They prevented a lot of companies, right? It was very difficult and very expensive to get an American car in South Korea during this time because they were trying to protect their infant industry. The infant industry was car sales, right? So they're trying to protect this infant industry. They're using the money from textiles to industrialize. We call this import substitution industrialization. Right? That's the process that occurred. And so by doing this, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Brazil, and Mexico, they industrialized. They got better, right? And then once they got their infant industry off the ground, once South Korea got Daewoo off the ground, then they didn't need labor suppression. They could go into all these other advanced industries, and then they could go into computers and communications and cell phones and all sorts of technology, and now they're a very industrialized country, right? Labor suppression was temporary in order to get to a better part of industrialization, right? That was the argument. So the argument is labor suppression helps you industrialize. The problem is it doesn't hold in all cases, right? If we were to look at a random sample, we would see that places with labor suppression, the amount of labor suppression, doesn't help them actually do better at all. The labor suppression wasn't necessarily part of it. Now, there might be a lot of theoretical reasons why some cases do better than others, but if we just look at the data, it's not supported, right? If we just look at the raw quantitative data, it's not supported that greater labor suppression means more industrialization. So the first part is that if we had a random sample, we wouldn't have the selection bias. And there is some clear selection bias when we're looking at specific cases, right? The Southeast Asian tigers, right, they were going to do very well. They were sort of suited to do very well. It's very easy to have a shipping lane between Korea and other places in the world because Japan and China already have shipping lanes. So the shipping lanes already exist. They're easier to make trades. You also had other places around that area that had a domestic demand for cars. And Daewoo made a cheaper car, right, than the American cost of a car. And so it was easier to get those through. So there was a selection bias there. However, that doesn't mean you just have to completely randomize, right? You can do a couple things. As long as the selection is not tied to the dependent variable, you can exclude some cases, right? If you want to look at economic growth, you don't want to look at the communist states. Communist states have a state-run economy. So if you're trying to look at the growth in market economies, you can exclude communist states because they don't apply. You can exclude resource-rich states because they have what's called a resource curse, which we'll talk about later. Basically, if you have a ton of oil, you're not going to build up your industry. You're just going to sell your oil, and that's how your government's going to make money. We call that rent-seeking. So instead of developing this big economic system, right, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Yemen, a few other places, Iran, they didn't develop as much because they were selling oil and that funded their government programs. So there was no incentive to go out and build an economic structure that they would require all this middle class and all this education right? It would be very expensive and difficult to do when you could just sell your resources. So we're going to exclude those because they don't have the incentives to industrialize. And then we're going to include places that have long civil wars, right? If you're looking in the later part of the 20th century about something, you're going to exclude Lebanon. It was through a long civil war. And that's going to change your data. You're going to have missing data. You have an economic system that just is not working. When economists look at the behavior of certain practices and policies in the United States and anywhere in the world, they're probably going to have to make some exception for 2010 and 2020 and 2021, right? The pandemic shifted a lot of our behaviors. So if we want accurate models, we might be excluding those years because we know why those economies are different, we know why they wouldn't be treated the same, and we can exclude those cases. So as long as it's not connected to the dependent variable, you can exclude some cases, you just can't exclude them so much that it creates selection bias. Okay. So the next part is we want to make sure when we're identifying and coding variables, we're very clear. And Geddes is very good about this. Geddes in all of her work is very good about this. She says the dependent variable is GNP per capita. The difference between GDP and GNP is whatever citizens of that state make. So if you're looking at GNP, it doesn't matter where the citizens of that state are, right? Americans who work in France are contributing to the GNP of the United States. So that's about the citizens no matter where they are. The GDP is the economics of the state geographically. So the people, citizen or not, in that region. I don't expect you to memorize that. That's not important. I was just looking at it today. The difference between GNP and GDP is not something I expect you to know, so don't worry about that. The important part is she explains very clearly, here's the dependent variable. Now, the independent variable is this repression index. Well, how did I come up with this index? I looked at, are unions free to organize? Are they controlled by the government? Because if unions are controlled by government or whoever's in charge, then they're not really free to help laborers. Are strikes legal? In a lot of places, and in fact in the United States until about the 1930s, if you were part of a union and you had to get a strike, the police would come and force you to go back to work and beat you to go back to work because it was illegal for you to have a strike, which makes the unions very weak. And then, can the unions involve themselves in politics, right? Can they lobby for the candidates that they like, right? Can they engage in those aspects? And so the more you can unionize, the lower score you got, and the other way it worked, right? So now we're going to look at all of the cases. Let's look at the cases that, not just the newly industrialized country, the NICs, right? But let's look at all of the cases that exist who have labor suppression. And if I look at just labor suppression and economic growth, we see that there's not a clear relationship between these two. The data does not support that. So then we get into this very famous argument where Geddes goes right after Skocpol. And the first part is she does a very good job of explaining Skocpol's argument, which is why I don't have to read Skocpol's book and we have this article instead. Effectively, it follows a path-dependent argument, a chronological argument. So these things happen in order. The first is you have an external military threat. Somewhere, another country, another state, defeats the country we're talking about, and it might invade, right? So the country just can't defend itself. And it's at risk of just being eliminated as a country. And so military leaders, they say, we need all of these changes. We need reforms. We need a change in the government so that we can ensure our survival. We need to make sure we have more money going to arms. We need to get people more involved in this government. The problem is the dominant class, the elites that are in charge when this happens, they're status quo defenders. They like the world the way it is. They don't want the world to change. And so they try to stop that. They try to say, no, we don't want to change that. And if they're independent, if they have their own money, if they're landlords or they own mines, they don't rely on the state, right? Some elites rely on the state. They're bureaucrats, or they rely on the ethnic group that's in charge to sort of provide them with resources, right? Or they get their wages directly from the government, right, if they are an employee. Or they have access to some oil well, and they use that to rent, right? Rent is where you get a certain amount of money for selling the product. You get a certain share of that, right? So rent-seeking behavior is, I'm going to sell this resource we have, and I'm going to take a portion of it, right? So if you're relying on the state, you can't do this, right? So the next part is they have to be economically independent. If they are economically independent, they say, no, I don't want to work with the other elites. I don't like this change that's happening. I'm going to split apart. There's going to be an elite fracture. I want to see a different behavior. And because I want a different behavior, and I don't want to include the existing elites, essentially what I need is to replace those elites and replace the system that puts those elites in power, those other elites. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to reach out to the masses, the peasantry, the proletariat. And so while the elites are doing this, the peasants are doing something different. The peasants have to be autonomous. That's the very first part. They have to be autonomous. So they have to be left alone, right? There's no supervision. The landlord doesn't care. And then they see the elite fracture. They see that the elites are no longer a cohesive group. And they say, this is our opportunity. This is a time where we can rebel. Not necessarily have a revolution, but we can say, we don't like the deal we're getting. We demand a better deal. There's more of us than there are of you. So either you give us better wages, a better lifestyle, better rights, or we're going to tear everything down, right? Rebellion, right? And so the elites work with one of the groups. One of the elite groups goes, okay, masses, peasants, we're going to work with you and we're going to have a revolution where your class has more power in the system. The lower class has more power in the system. We're going to change that aspect. And so the dissatisfied elites, the dominant class, the ones that are unhappy, they mobilize the peasants. They organize them. They help identify leaders that can work with. And there's two ways that this can happen. The first is these normative calls, right? This is the sort of Russian sort of communist revolutions where they're saying that we have to have a different world. We have to liberate you from these capitalist ideals. We have to liberate you from religion and all these other factors. And we're going to make your life better, and you can go out and live the better life, right? Or the Chinese Revolution, right? You can get away from all this capitalist, materialist things that are tying you down, and you can go live a better, purer life by going to the farms and working, right? Getting back to an agrarian society. Now, obviously, we have some shifts here and there. The other thing is this elite realignment. We're saying, well, the elites that exist, that I don't want to share power with them, they're calling for these reforms I don't like. So how about you as a lower class, you build up some elites in your system, and then I share power with someone in your group. I give power to some of the people in your lower class so that they can identify and represent you, right, and provide the things that you want. And so those are two ways that this can happen. So that's Geddes explaining Skocpol. It's a bit of a caricature, but that's fine. We have what we need to understand. So now we'd see, okay, this difference between negative cases and deviant cases. And let me make sure we have enough time because I don't want to, yeah, we're good. We're good. Okay. So a negative case is just, okay, you didn't have those aspects, so you didn't have that outcome, right? Britain and Germany, the owners of the means of production, they were there every day. These are factories. The owner's right there. So you can't have a rebellion. You can't organize because the owner's going to see it and they're going to put a stop to that behavior, right? They don't want you to unionize. That's going to create a cost to them they didn't have before. So that's a negative case. There's something missing that, of course, the outcome wouldn't occur. Skocpol mentions those, discusses the difference between negative cases that have what is necessary and between those that have what is sufficient, right? France, China, Russia, they have what is sufficient for a social revolution. They have all the necessary factors, they exist, and therefore a social revolution is going to occur because of the structural argument. The people don't matter, the structure matters. Geddes is saying, well, what about these deviant cases, right? You're going to argue that you need autonomous individuals, you need an autonomous peasantry, and you need some sort of elite fracture and an external threat, and you should get a revolution. Well, what if I show you a bunch of cases that don't fit? Those are deviant cases. These are cases where the outcome is expected but doesn't occur. And so let's look at these new cases. This is Mexico and El Salvador and Guatemala, and this is the Latin American cases. The elites had their own independent economic base. They had their land, they had mine ownerships, they had all the things that they needed. The villages were autonomous, right? Landlords in South America very rarely went out to their plantations, to their farms, agricultural societies, as long as they provide. So it meets the autonomous aspect, it meets the independent economic base of the elites, and there's definitely an external threat. Many of them lost a war and then were invaded by a foreign source. And so you have these factors, and so out of 10 cases, only one of them fits the social revolution, right, the expected by Skocpol. Only one. 2 other cases had social resolution without an external threat. So if an external threat is necessary, why did those cases still have a social resolution? And why did the 7 other cases which fit the criteria not have a social resolution, right? That's a 70% failure rate of the model, right? That's problematic if you have that high of a failure rate of the models that you're suggesting, right? If you're wrong 70% of the time, there's an issue. So then Geddes says, well, okay, there are clear flaws and weaknesses in the arguments made by Skocpol. Skocpol has some flaws, and Geddes mentions some other works in this article as well, but we're going to focus on Skocpol. But this is not a disconfirmation. I'm going to stop short. Geddes stops short and says, okay, there are flaws, but I'm not going to say I've disproven the arguments made by Skocpol, because there might be some validity to France, China, and Russia being different from Latin America. There are cultural aspects, there are religious aspects, there are historical aspects that are very different between the 2 periods. So maybe the issue is that it only applies in those countries. That only applies as countries with long histories, France, Russia, and China, long histories. Maybe that doesn't apply in Latin America because they have much shorter histories and they don't behave the same way. Maybe Latin America is different because it's under that Monroe Doctrine or the American doctrine, right? That it's insulated from external pressure, right? The United States in the 20th century said everything in the Americas is ours, and you don't influence that, and we engage in that, right? And for a long time, that was the case, that Russia, the Soviet Union, the European states, they didn't trade or involve themselves as much with South America because the United States claimed that entire hemisphere. Right? The Western Hemisphere was just claimed by the US. And because it was such a superpower, it could do that. It could say, you don't influence these other places. This is our world. You stay out of it, right? So you might have a difference because they only have one power, and that power might be saying, no, you don't need a revolution. You're fine where you're at, right? We know that powerful states will often prop up autocratic regimes or authoritarian regimes because it serves their interests, right? So we have those aspects that might be different. And my Skocpol might be right in the cases that they give. It just may not be generalizable, right? It might have internal validity, but it may not have external validity, and that's a very important distinction to make. The other part is this idea of operationalization. And whenever you're doing scientific work, you take a case that you're looking at, and you take some ideas and concepts, and you have to turn them into mechanisms. If we go back and we look at what it means to be labor suppression in Geddes' argument, it's whether or not unions can effectively work. Unions. What we don't see is the amount of physical violence against laborers. The way that Geddes operationalizes, right, labor suppression is the legal aspects, the governmental aspects. It doesn't include the violence aspects. It doesn't include the societal aspects, where police officers feel comfortable, law enforcement feels comfortable, right, physically assaulting, right, people who are trying to unionize. Right? That's a different operationalization, right? And this gets to this thing about a proxy versus the direct measurement, right? Is your measurement direct, right? If I talk about battle deaths, right, this is something that I talk about more than other things, right? I'm talking about how many people died. That is a direct measure. Did that person die? If I talk about the intensity of a conflict and about how many conflicts there are and how many engagements there are, that's a proxy of intensity. Because I don't really know how intense the people in those wars are treating it. Do they think this is all-out war? Do they think this is skirmishes? Right? What's the intensity in that area? I have to proxy that in some way. If we talk about intentions or people's perceptions, we have to proxy it some way. If I want to know how religious a person is, the proxy that I use is how often do they go to church. We see this a lot, right? People report how often they go to church. What we added later in the 1990s was how religious or how spiritual you are. Because you might go to church all the time and it's just a normal societal function. You just do it because that's what you've always done, right? But you don't feel very religious. And you might never go to church, but you might feel, or a synagogue, mosque, whatever the religion is, but you might feel incredibly tied to that religion. You just don't go to the building. So when we talk about this, is it a proxy, is it direct? And because of that, because we're looking at from these perspectives, Geddes and Skocpol can be right. Are their arguments valid? Are we looking at valid arguments? Let's make sure that we're on the same page when we're discussing this. It's not one is right and one is wrong. They both have good arguments. Why are they good arguments? And that's more important. Why are they good arguments? Okay. The last part that Geddes is going to talk about is selection bias and time series analysis. So the endpoints in a selected, are the endpoints selected in neutral fashion? So when you're choosing what years to include in a time series analysis, right? Let's say, okay, I want to look at the years between 1960 and 1980. Those are going to have a different factor, right? And there are some things where if you added 1 year, we would think very differently. In 1988, right, around 1988, most scholars thought that the Soviet Union was incredibly stable. We did all these surveys where we would ask people in the Soviet Union whether or not they planned on staying, and they would always say yes, right? This is called social desirability bias. If you're in a communist state and someone asks you, do you like the communist state? You say yes, because otherwise you could be harmed. The bad things could happen to you if you don't say you don't like a state when you know that there are purges and people are dying for their beliefs. So in 1988, we thought it was stable because we had misinformation. In 1989, a bunch of Soviet states became independent. It was the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So if you ask in 1988, if your data set ends in 1988, you have a problem. Because the very next year, the entire society, the entire global structure changes. In 1992, right, the Soviet Union has an economic collapse, and Russia has an economic collapse. And they go to a barter system for a while until they build their economy back up. So when with the years we're including, are we looking at them at the right times? Are we looking at successful endings? Are we looking at endpoints that are natural and don't impact the data? That's very important. The last part is the data and artifact, right? Now, one of the things that you used to look at is if you had a growing bureaucracy, how do you know if the bureaucracy is growing? How do you know if the government's growing? Until about the 1980s, you would look at typewriter sales, right? This was a way to look at how big government is. What are they buying? How many people are they hiring? If you really had a documented, strong bureaucracy, right? Because in a bureaucracy, everything is documented. If you really have a functional bureaucracy that's based on merit and following rule of law, you have all this documentation. Because you have all this documentation, to function more effectively, you should see typewriter sales. Well, in 1990, that's nonsense. 1990 moving forward, you have a technological shift. Right? Computers replace typewriters, and so that data, that there's an artifact of that data, right? Typewriter sales are no longer a good metric for your bureaucratic growth, if they ever will. You have normative shifts, right? If you look at voting records before 1920 and after 1920 or 1918, there's a huge uptick in voters and the number of voters. Well, why? Because in the United States, women got the right to vote. If you look at the difference between 1905 and 1950 across the globe, votership went way up. Why? Women were allowed to vote, right? So you have a normative shift that changes it, and then a new paradigm. Until about the 1980s, you had this sort of metaphysics involved, you had rational choice, you had all these arguments. And in the 1980s and 1990s, we saw a bunch of new arguments coming in. Right? One is this behavioralism, right? This belief that your biology dictates your behavior, your genetics dictate your behavior. These only come into understanding about how your behavior will follow certain aspects because we learn about genetics and DNA, right, and heritage and behavioralism because the science has advanced. So the paradigm might shift. So in time series analysis, maybe we can't look at certain things at certain times because those didn't exist in those times. Or maybe, right, if we look at typewriters, it's only a short period of time that exists. Or, right, radio wiring, or teletype, right, or any of those other technologies that no longer are part of daily life, they have a time period and they're an artifact. They only exist in certain times. And if you try and extend them out, it won't make sense because it's an artifact of that time, right? Right, the telegraph becomes this incredibly important design in the 20th century as we're moving to the 20th century, but very, very quickly, right, as a telephone replaces it, becomes almost useless, and eventually sort of is completely taken out and is now only used in very specific circumstances. Okay, so that is all the material that will be covered. So now I want to spend the next 30 minutes explaining the exam to you so that you understand what you need to be covering for this exam. And the first part is I might as well stop sharing that. The first part that I really want you to get into, I like to actually look at the exam while I'm explaining what I want you to think about, and then that way I'm not like leading you down the wrong path. Sorry, it's just going to take a second. All right, the first part, let me open up the files, is from this first lecture. I really want all of you to sort of get a taste for what I'm talking about when I talk about ontology, epistemology, and methodology. Sorry, I've got too many windows that I'm trying to. Those of you on the YouTube should be able to see this one now. And then, why is that? Okay. Okay, that's weird. I apologize. Okay, there we go. All right, so the first part that's very important is that, that's very important is this idea of how are we defining the world? How are we defining the world? How are we setting it up? Hopefully you guys can see for those of you in both cases, you should be looking at the ontology website, the first lecture. So the first question is, right, what is the ontology? What is the world that we are in, right? So in every one of these essay questions, think about it. Is this an objective reality? Are we measuring things that can be quantifiable and can be looked at and I can say that is something we can all agree, we can all go to the same thing. If I'm doing statistical regression, I have to be typically in an objective reality. There's some exceptions, but we're not going to worry about that until after this exam. Is the world directly observable? Can you look at the world and say, okay, that's how many tons of wheat? That's how many thousands of pounds or dollars of rice that have been exported, right? That's the value of the dollar on this given day, right? Now here's the bleed over, right? When I talk about intersubjective reality, is the dollar just worth something? We're talking about 1960s where the dollar's worth, right? Every dollar is worth a certain amount of gold. Or is this an intersubjective reality where we agree on the value of things? We agree on the norms, we agree on the rules, right? Are we agreeing on what things are? Shared perception, right? Are we saying this is something we agree on? We agree the sky is blue. We agree that we exchange dollars for goods and services, right? We don't harm each other, right? We have rule of law, right? You follow the rules to the best of your ability, right? Agreement. Intersubjective reality is what do we agree is reality. Objective reality is it exists, doesn't need us, right? It's just there, it's directly observable, and if we observe it, we'll come to the same observation because we're looking at the same thing, right? Intersubjective reality is we sort of share our perceptions. And then is this a subjective reality? Subjective reality is when we don't share perceptions. We disagree about what we're looking at, right? Feminist theory and Charles Mills, when he's talking about in his book Blackness of about sort of black perspectives, black male's perspectives, because he would most likely agree that he doesn't know about female perspective, right? That when we're looking at the same thing, we see different things, right? Minorities and females see more microaggressions. They perceive more microaggressions, right? And I'm not going to speak to whether or not they're real or not. I don't perceive them in the same way. But that doesn't mean they aren't occurring. That just means our perceptions are different, right? And that's a subjective reality. So I really want you to know these differences in these three different types of ontology. It's very important. The next is epistemology. Now, I want you to know a couple of things. The first is, right, how are we doing this? Is this scientific? Is the way that we're approaching scientific? Is it empirical? Are we gathering evidence through observation? Are we just looking at things and we can see that they're free and fair or see that they're occurring a certain way? Or are we making a series of logical arguments, right? Is this inductive reasoning, right? Do I see people voting a certain way and make assumptions about their behavior or a logical argument about their behavior? Or do I see them voting a certain way and just say, here's what the data says, right? They voted, this is what they voted for, right? That's deductive. Inductive says, right, let's use this arrangement. They voted for Biden, which means they wanted Biden, right? They chose to vote for Biden. Or a bunch of people chose not to vote. Why did they choose not to vote? Because they believed that their vote wouldn't count. Or, right, they believed that the election was being stolen. Whatever they believe, right, we're trying to understand the logical argument for why their behavior followed a certain path, right? Logical arguments. Inductive reasoning is saying, I observed this, I'm making this assumption. Either I assume humans are rational, or I assume states are interested in their own survival, and then because I observed this, and because I have this rationale, or this explanation or assumption, this is why it occurred. Right? This helps explain why it occurred, because I'm using this inductive reasoning, a series of logical arguments. And then you don't have to include probability theory if you want. The only part is that there's a difference between probabilistic, it's likely to occur, and deterministic. And I want you to understand that. Is it deterministic? Because Skocpol says if you have these characteristics, you're going to have social revolution. Is that true? Do you agree with that? Do you believe that the argument is flawed in some way? Discuss that, right? So epistemology matters as much. And the methodology. Know that the two methodologies that I want you to discuss are quantitative versus qualitative. Now, there are way more methodologies than that. But I really want you to know quantitative versus qualitative. I want you to understand quantitative versus qualitative. I want you to understand that quantitative is numbers, right? And qualitative is words, right? Very simple. Quantitative is thin. It's thin analysis, right? I take everything and I sort of smash it into a number, right? Whereas when we talk about qualitative, I expand, I pull apart, right? I try to understand every little detail. I try to get as much about the context as I can. It's thick. It's description. It's very thick. Now, there are pros and cons. Right? I'm going to ask you about the pros and cons. What are the pros and cons of quantitative, right? If it's thin, great, you can use it a lot. It's very easy to sort of get repetition, and we can all look at the same numbers, but what is it missing? What are the missing aspects of it? And then qualitative, yeah, it's got all this description, but how do I apply that to other cases? Can I really look at South Korea and compare it to Mexico? Is there so much detail that it stops being comparable? That we stop seeing similarities and we just see cases, right? Are we just describing it, or are we trying to find things that are similar and dissimilar? Understand that an independent variable is a cause and a dependent variable is an effect, right? Independent variable cause, dependent variable effect. Okay, so now 1 second. So ontology is very important. How you build the world. Really go back and read Skocpol and Geddes if you didn't get a clear reading. If I said something, you're like, I did not see the reading at all, especially Geddes. Geddes really gets to the heart of the matters. If there are things you don't understand, remember you have all week, you could email me, we can meet up. I will talk to you about the exam. The thing is, if you're talking to me and you're like, oh, I'm going to write something different because of what you said, that's a resource. It's open book, it's open note. You have all week. The only thing you cannot do is share answers. You can even sort of discuss with each other. You just can't share answers, right? If you want to discuss with another classmate and say, this is what I think I got, that's not cheating. This is an essay exam. Now, if you basically just use the same words in the same way, there is a system that I have that checks how much overlap there is between your exam responses. So don't just use the same response. I promise you will get caught. It's not worth it. The other part is use your words. Use the words that you know, right? Use the words that you know. So we talked about ontology, epistemology, and methodology. I need you to know independent variable, dependent variable. Even if you just think independent variable is the cause and dependent variable is the effect, that's okay. But you need to understand that relationship. How do we test for those relationships? How do we understand what those relationships are, right? What are the tests that we can do to see if an independent and dependent variable have a relationship, a causal relationship, right? How do we see causation? How do we argue for cause, right? And then what does it mean to be spurious? I want you to learn this word, because this is one of those things that the more that you understand this, right, are those relationships spurious? Is there something else explaining them that's not in the model, right? Sorry, I don't have... The chat window sort of dropped out. Okay. I don't see any questions yet. Now, the next part is we've just been talking about this, so I'm not going to review it again. But I want you to look at Skocpol and Geddes. I want you to choose a side. Not normative, just what are the arguments that you can support more than the other? Choose one of them, right? Assume that they're both valid, right? That they both are good arguments. Which one is better? Why is it better, right? Explain why one of them, and I don't mean better because you like it more, right? Avoid normative responses. Which one do you think will be more accurate? Which one do you think will work better and provide better results and provide better predictions that where it will work in the real world, right? Because that's the whole point is we say, here's what we expect to happen in these cases. The next time a case like this occurs, it should follow this pattern, right? If you're Skocpol and you say, okay, you have a leak fracture and an external threat, autonomous population, you should see a social revolution. You should see a revolution. You should see a social revolution, a change, a transformative change in that society, right? Geddes would say, no, those things don't mean a revolution. You have to look at the whole case, right? What other things are driving revolution, right? Yes, those things are there. They might be necessary, but that doesn't mean they're sufficient. That doesn't mean they're good enough to get to a social revolution. That just means that they're there, right? And so look at these two arguments, choose between the two. Are you a fan of determinism and you support Skocpol where it's sufficient, it will happen? Or are you falling into the camp of Geddes and you're saying, it's probable that it'll happen, it's likely that it'll happen, but that doesn't mean it will happen. And then explain why both arguments can be valid. Explain why you can have these two arguments. Choose one, say this one is better, but also, why is there validity in both? Why can a scientific field have validity in both aspects of this, right? What are the aspects of science that allow this? And you can have a lot of different answers. You can say they're choosing different ontologies, right? Skocpol is structural. It's an objective reality, right? I observe these things, they exist, right? It's not agency. People don't just choose this. It's not purposeful. They agree to go after evolution. It's structural. The real world follows this pattern, right? Where Geddes might be making an argument of an intersubjective reality and say, you know, people don't always agree on their expectations. People don't always agree that they're autonomous. They don't always agree and perceive the same level of a leaf fracture, right? They may not notice a leaf fracture. They may not perceive it, right? The lower class, right, if we're talking about sort of Marxism, they may not recognize when there's leaf fracture at all. They might just miss that opportunity. And so it's probabilistic, right? And so they can both be valid. All of those arguments can be there. The next question, I really want you to get this thick versus thin. Right? If you notice there's a lot of repetition, try not to use the same answer for multiple questions. Try to give a unique take on each question. When you're doing this thick versus thin, describing the pros and cons of a thick versus thin analysis, right? Quantitative being thin and qualitative being thick. Give the advantages and disadvantages. Make those advantages and disadvantages clear. Why would one of those methods be better suited for a specific case? Why would qualitative be better in the South Korean industrialization case than quantitative methods, thin methods, right? What is it that better explains that case, right? Should we be looking at the qualities and the specific culture and context of South Korea, or is this a numbers game? That they had a certain amount of labor suppression, they had a market economy, right? And they had an infant industry that they grew, and that's a mathematical sort of deductive process. They went step by step by step, and then we just use the logic and the deduction to follow the chain of events, and that's going to get us there, right? What is there that helps us explain the South Korea's industrialization in the late 20th century? And then I have one extra credit question that will be available to you, and that's about counterfactual analysis. So there's a specific slide on counterfactual analysis. There's extra credit, I'm not going to cover it. I did cover it. We talked about this. I'm just like, oh, we're just going to skip it. But I want you to think what changes a counterfactual analysis from just being a guess, right? We could just say, oh, something's different. Let's just guess, right? What makes it different? Find the part of this that says, okay, this is how counterfactual analysis can be scientific. This is how counterfactual analysis can really contribute to the endeavors and the research design of comparative politics, right? Explain that, and that's going to be extra credit. And the best part about that is essentially what I'm going to do. Let's just do some housekeeping so we can all be on the same page. I want to be able to get to, sorry, just give me 1 second. So you should both be able to see this. Are you going to let me type? Okay, so there's a bit of a delay. So I'm not going to save this, but you guys should be able to see it when I'm typing. It's quite the delay here, but it's worth 10% of your grade. Not a ton, but 10% of your grade. There are 4 questions, right? So what I'm going to do is they're 2.5 points each. And then the extra credit question, my hands, that's worth 1 point. Now, it's going to look like it's 0, but it's worth 1 point, and I promise you it'll make adjustments. Like, it's going to be worth 0, but then I'm going to add points. The part about this is the highest score, the highest possible score is 11 out of 10, right? Which means that you can get 110% on this exam. It's possible. So in all my exams, I give a little extra credit. I want you to have a chance. Try and answer every question, right? Every time I have an essay exam, one of the reasons that a bunch of people fail is they just don't answer the questions. Do not do this on Thursday. Don't try to just write this on Thursday or Friday morning. You'll run out of time and you'll get a bad score. Make sure you give this some time. And in exchange, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you time back next week, right? I'm not going to keep you the whole time because we're not going to be behind. We'll sort of be caught up. And I will continue to do that. I'll give you some. It might end up being as much time as sort of you're taking for the exam. And we'll talk about that and how we can make this fair. Because normally if you'd be in the classroom, we'd have some more opportunities to discuss it. When you're writing this, right, I think the standard is 250 to 500 words per question. So you're going to be writing a bit. You need to answer every part of the question. It has multiple parts. I want you to explain every part. If you miss a part, you're going to get a deduction right away. No matter how good one part, you need to answer every part. And I want you to stress critical analysis. I want you to think about this, right? I want you to think about this critically, and I want you to use your own words. Don't quote, don't use the language. Speak to me in the words that are comfortable for you to use. Because if you explain it to me and you're like, oh, I hear words, the thing is if you do a really good job of explaining it, that you took in the material and you understand what I'm trying to get at, but the words you use are a little off, or there's a language barrier, I'm going to see that, okay, you stressed the topic that we're covering, you took in the material, and even though the words are a little off, that's a minor deduction. That's the thing is, my grammar, my spelling, all of those things are very bad, right? I grew up in a technological era. At one point, I spoke multiple languages. I have very bad spelling. I struggle, right, in multiple things, right? I had to look up Daewoo 3 times because I spell it in Korean. I have no idea how to spell it in English, right? So I'm not going to penalize you if your sentence structure is bad. I'm not going to penalize you if you're using words that don't exactly fit. I'm going to critique you heavily to explain where I'd like you to improve, but that's not why your grade is going to go down. Your grade will go down if you don't cover the material, you don't take time to really answer the questions, and you don't spend some time thinking about why you're answering the way you're answering, right? So make sure you do those things, and then make sure that there are no normative statements. And this is something that's going to come up a lot. Don't say I like Geddes more than Skocpol. Say the arguments that Geddes makes are more plausible than the arguments suggested by Skocpol, right? Change your language to say this is the scientific evidence, this is what is supported by the evidence, this is what is not supported. I find this argument to be more supportive because it follows this logical chain of events, right? So try to make sure to focus on those things. Okay, it will be live in the next 10 minutes. I was just looking at it, I didn't make sure it's there. Make sure you submit it early, right? Don't try and submit it the morning of, right? Because I don't do late exams, and you have all week to do this. Make sure you deal with every question. Don't copy from another person. Don't do quotes. Don't paste from the material. Don't ever use quotes in my class. Quotes are just not a functional aspect of political science, right? I want you to use your words. It's very important. Answer this to the best of your ability. After this exam, there will be some multiple choice components, right? Exam 2 and exam 3 will have multiple choice where you're like, oh, I know exactly what the answer is, and I can just click on that. In this exam, I really need to get a sense of where the class is at. I need to get a sense of where your thinking is, your language, whether or not there's language barriers. I need to get an assessment of you. And so the reason why I took the quiz 3 out, I'm going to add it back in. It's going to have more extra credit just sort of to benefit you. But I really need to get an assessment of how you speak. Normally when you're in a classroom, I get it. If some of you speak differently or you understand differently, I'm not getting any feedback. It's not your fault. It's definitely not your fault. But I'm not getting any feedback about what you're understanding. And I can't see when your eyes glaze over. I can't see when you're disconnected. I can't see when you're frustrated that I'm spending too much time being too repetitive. All of those things are disconnected. So one of the things that's really important to me is this exam is going to tell me, when did I spend too much time on something? What do I still need to focus on so we can really get it? Because it's going to be the foundation for the rest of the course. What are the things that is not clear? What are the things that you don't agree about, right? What are the aspects that we're really getting into? And by grading this exam and communicating with you, you're grading the exam and discussing it, it's going to work. Now, if you get a bad grade and you don't like your grade, email me. We'll talk about it, right? Everything is a negotiation. Everything is for sale. Everything is a negotiation, right? I am a pure capitalist, right? I don't accept bribes or anything crazy like that. But you can always talk to me. This is what I got from this argument, right? You said to discuss these topics, and in the Sage handbook in chapter 3 or chapter 4, it made this point, and that's where I got from that. And we'll discuss it, and that can improve your grade. You can make the logical argument that you should deserve a different grade. I'm totally okay with that, right? The whole point is for you to have critical analysis and thought. So make sure you're bringing those things in. Make sure you take the time. If I see a consistent effort on the exams, that will impact your grade as well, right? If I'm like, you really put in the effort and there was so much you get, I have the ability to say, okay, this exam was too difficult, and sort of change that bar a little bit to make sure it's fitting with this class's expectations. So put in your best effort. The exam is going to be available in just a few minutes because I want to close all this out before I make the exam live in case there's a problem with that. This might be the last time I do YouTube, just so you know. So a couple of things, the people on YouTube, one of the things is that there are a lot of views, right? A lot of people are watching the videos after the fact, but you're not here. And I know that there would be more questions if more people were here. I think there are 11 out of 26. It's less than 50% this early in the semester. The other part is that YouTube is just the analytics. The analytics do things like how much have your screen on, and it tells me that you're like not watching the video or when you're watching, or right how much engagement there is. And so does the WebEx, and the WebEx engagement is much higher, even though there's fewer people doing it. So we're gonna talk about this first exam. It's likely that I'm gonna pull the YouTube. I know that means everyone has to be in the WebEx, but one of the things that's concerning is that you're not engaging, and I don't want you to be disadvantaged. So we're gonna talk about this. Everything's negotiation, but I really want you to consider how much you're getting from this exchange, right? Are you really learning from this? Are you gonna be able to pass this class? I don't want anyone to fail. I hate failing people. I hate it. I feel like I failed when you failed. So talk to me. We'll talk about the best engagement. Do as best you can in the exam. When we come back from the exam next week, I expect more communication, right? I want you guys asking me questions. I don't understand why I got this. And ask them in the chat, or ask them, through the voice on the WebEx, or ask them, through the YouTube questions. Engage and ask questions and challenge why you got the score you got. And that will be part of the learning process so we can get on the same page. Okay. I think I covered a ton of material. I reviewed the lecture. All the slides are up. All the articles are available. make sure that you are sort of taking this into account. And if you have any questions, email me, message me. I am available. My schedule is crazy, so if you have a panic attack at 2 o'clock in the morning, I might be up. Message me, email me, and maybe I have an answer for your question, and I might be able to help you with that. And I would be happy to discuss the exam with you, even if you've already looked at it. That's not an issue. All of the readings within the library website. That shouldn't be a problem. Sorry, I just saw the question. I know there's a bit of a delay, but yeah, hopefully this answers your question, Faisha, that every time you need a reading, it's on the library website. So just go to the library.unlv.edu and just type in the title from the syllabus, and you should be able to find the readings online. But, right, the other thing is I expect you to have read before you come in, right? A lot of this is going to be confusing if you don't read it and you come in, right? I read all this stuff. I read this stuff last night. I went back through and read it to make sure I had the details right so I didn't misrepresent. So make sure you're reading the material beforehand. That way you can understand it better when I'm discussing it. But yeah, they're all available through the library website. And if they're not, someone message me, because that's a problem. But I read them all last night. So I love Skocpol's book, and I spent a lot of time reading it. So that's it for today. Let me stop the stream and get out of this. But I am available. I have office hours. So if anyone gets this and they need to message me, they need to WebEx, they need to talk, I am available. Feel free to message me, and we will go from there, right? And just do your best on this exam and take the exam. To actually take the, I cannot stress this enough. You cannot pass this class if you don't do the exams. So take the exam. A bad grade on exam is always better. A bad grade on exam is always better than a 0. A 0 is the worst case scenario. And if you just try, there's no way you'll get a 0. So put in the effort, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you for seeing me today, and I hope you have a